Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man with intentions of having a friendly conversation is told something that will haunt him forever. So, please share with us if you have ever seen the Sunflower Room.
In September of 2009, I was at a wine-hazed after-party at my friend Micah's place. I ended up sharing a bottle of white with a stranger. We'd been chatting all night, laughing at everything and nothing. We'd settled ourselves on a balcony, a ridiculous pile of blankets, sofa cushions, and pillows, all kinds of cozy. Other people at the party had come and gone, but we'd stayed there for hours. She was from a small town in Minnesota, but had come to West Virginia for her master's degree. She was just going to stay out here in Juniper for a few days to help her friend move. We don't get a lot of visitors out here. Somewhere around the 3 a.m. mark, we finished our bottle. She was half asleep on my shoulder, waking herself every now and then with little hiccups.
Whenever I get sad, like really sad, I do this thing,
She said.
Close your eyes.
Sure, yeah, I nodded.
I imagine this door, a white door. Can you see it?
Yeah.
So I open it, and there's this room, but with a dirt floor. Earthy, fresh with rain. You gotta, smell it.
I tried my best. I was enthralled by the smell of her coconut shampoo, but there was something else there. A tinge of soil, rich with morning dew. I smell it, yeah.
So, I take what makes me sad, and I put it into a little seed. And then I plant it. I put it away. And later, it blooms into this beautiful sunflower.
So it's like a big sunflower room.
Yeah, but they get this blue shade.
She smiled.
Because they're sad.
Are you sad? She smiled and shook her head. I stayed awake as long as I could, trying to be a good shoulder for her to sleep on. And by the time I woke up, she was gone. Now, this was many years ago. It was one of those beautiful early adult memories that just stick with you, which you can look back on whenever life doesn't seem worth the trouble. When my studies were too much, or I had a bad breakup, or a rough day at work, that memory was my happy place. Back on that balcony with that gentle weight on my shoulder. Nowadays, I work as a foreman at a local processing plant. Not that glamorous, but it gives me everything I need. You can't underestimate the value of job security in this market. I certainly don't. I have been in a comfortable position for years. I can't complain. I've gotten a bit stuck in a rut, and those days of wine-hazed optimism feels like a bygone age. But then one night, I got a stark reminder. In that twilight hour between sleep and consciousness, I found myself looking up at the ceiling of my bedroom. The image of a white door came to mind. The same door that beautiful stranger had introduced me to so many years ago. A simple wooden door with white paint peeling off at the edges. A brass knocker that had started to turn green. In my mind's eye, the door swung open. Beyond it was a field of overgrown sunflowers, abandoned for years. Weeds and undergrowth, thick enough to form a solid barrier. A sour smell emanated from the room, and I could hear the buzzing off flies. As I reached to close the door, a thorned tendril fell out and wrapped itself around my neck, puncturing my skin. As I opened my mouth to scream, a blue sunflower forced itself into my mouth, rough petals pressing against the back of my tongue. And I woke up, coughing. I ran into the bathroom, gagging violently. I had this sour taste in my mouth and a rash around my neck, little inflamed dots, like I'd been strangled with poison ivy. I couldn't stop coughing, and my heart was racing. I'd had allergic reactions before, but never something that constricted my breathing. This was a first. Finally, I felt something dislodge from my lungs. I bent over the sink and forced it out of me. For a few agonizing seconds, it traveled up my throat and left me. Dozens of sunflower seeds, blue. That night messed me up. The next day, I bought a salve for my neck rash, but I'd already scratched it so bad that I had open wounds. It felt like my body was trying to reject my head. I was more tired than usual, and I kept getting these strange bouts of nausea. On top of it all, and I don't want to go into graphic detail, but there was blood in places where blood ought not to be. I took a few days off work and went to see a doctor. They did a few blood tests and concluded that I had gotten an allergic reaction, but they couldn't tell from what. They urged me to change my sheets and try a new non-perfume detergent. I also got a prescription for an epinephrine injector in case my throat closed completely. I spent the rest of the day cleaning, washing, and worrying. And as I went to bed that night, I tried to think about literally anything but that white door. But as soon as my head hit the pillow, there it was, and this time, it opened on its own. They knew I was coming back, and they were ready for me. Tendrils grabbed me, lifting me up into the ceiling, towards the white door with the brass knocker. I tried to hold back, getting cuts across my arms and legs. I could feel blisters building on my skin, turning into hundreds of painful little pearls. I felt my throat closing as I peered inside. There, in the middle of the field of forgotten flowers, I saw a woman. And as she turned towards me, I knew my heart was about to stop. A twinkle from the corner of her eye and the sheen of yellowed teeth from a wide smile. Pressure building. Chest cramping. I woke up in a panic, having forced myself to fall out of bed. I crawled across the floor, only realizing that I couldn't breathe seconds later. I couldn't feel the tip of my fingers, and my chest was ice cold. I counted my heartbeats as I fumbled my way into the bathroom. I reached for my EpiPen, accidentally knocking it down. It rolled across the floor and under the bathtub. I fell flat on my stomach, reaching for it. It was all the way in the back. My vision was fading as the bathroom floor felt colder. I flipped onto my back and tried to calm down. I had been without air for 65 seconds. I could make it to 90. I wouldn't die before 90. I counted it down, staring at the ceiling. It's 70. From that angle, I could have sworn there was a white door above. I could see the outline of the brass knocker and the cracks of the peeling paint. I could hear the tendrils crackle on the other side, and I could feel the eyes of the woman on the other side firmly fixed on me. 80. She was right there. She was waiting. Tonurale. Please, God. Suddenly, a trickle of air, like breathing through a straw. I could feel my senses coming back to me. The pressure in my face faded, leaving me flushed and teary-eyed on the bathroom floor. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't risk it. First thing in the morning, I called the doctor again, but they just reiterated the need to keep my EpiPen close. They booked me in for a blood test and suggested I slept somewhere else for a day or two. It could be an allergic reaction to bedbugs or dust mites. Looking through my contact list, my thumb stopped over an old college friend, Micah. It was at his party that I'd first met that girl in the first place. I texted him on a whim, and surprisingly, he was still around. He lived in town, and he was eager to meet up for a coffee. I met Micah at a small cafe across the street from a local archery range. He'd gained about 80 pounds from last time I'd seen him, but his youthful spirit was as evident as ever. I held out a hand to greet him, and the guy just wrapped me up in a big hug. We got a couple of bear claws and sat down by one of the back tables. Micah was eager to catch up. He told me all about his family and showed me plenty of pictures. His daughter, who wanted to go to veterinary school, his wife, who worked at the DMV, his twin boys, who were out camping.
They just love the wildlife.
Chuckled.
Ever heard of two 12-year-olds who are more interested in bird watching than video games?
After telling him about my life and my work, I tried to slip that old after party into the conversation. The same one we'd been to all those years ago. He knew exactly what I talked about.
Man, you had it in for her.
He grinned.
Ain't no secret.
You know what happened to her?
Why, you looking to make up for lost time?
Come on, man.
All right.
He smiled.
I'll tell you what I know.
Her name was Josie Fadden. She'd been the friend of a friend, and half the guys at the party had fallen madly in love with her, Micah included.
She got a lot of friend requests that night.
He laughed.
Don't think she accepted any.
You know what happened to her?
Not sure.
He shrugged.
I think she moved to Morgantown to get her master's.
She's still there. Micah leaned back and grinned as he finished his bear claw.
You are making up for lost time, aren't you?
To an outsider, what I did next might sound insane. But I had a few days off work, and I had to stay at a hotel either way. I figured I might as well do it in Morgantown. I drove up there over the afternoon. It was exhilarating. The only thing that could overpower my fear of the white door was the promise of seeing Josie again. It was hard to admit, but out of all the people who'd fallen in love with her that night, I had probably fallen the hardest. More than a decade later, I could smell her coconut shampoo. Still, it was hard to take my mind off my burning neck rash. Covering it with an itchy scarf didn't exactly help. I stopped at a gas station to look her up. I couldn't find her on any social media. I tried both Josie and Fadden, together and separately, but I got nothing. No relatives, no friends, nothing. For all intents and purposes, she was invisible. You don't see that often nowadays. I bought a burrito and ate it in the car. I pondered my options. You can't just walk around Morgantown and hope you bump into the right person. That might work back in Juniper, but there had to be a better way. Sitting there, I nodded off. The world turned dark, and I heard a set of rusty hinges turn. Something carefully moving through the underbrush. A pale hand reaching for me. Unblinking eyes coming out of the dark. It was just a few minutes, but it was enough to send me reeling out of the car. I fell to the pavement, coughing violently. It was getting worse. There was blood this time. I counted down the seconds. My breath came back at 35 seconds this time. If that's how bad it had gotten from a 5-minute nap, a full night's sleep would be the end of it. I got a strange look from a couple of teens walking past. They slowed down to check on me, but decided it was none of their business. I couldn't blame them. I got back in the car. I had to be careful, or I'd end up as a side note in the local paper. Sad man dead in parking lot. That, however, gave me an idea. The paper. Now, literal newspapers have been in decline for years, but Josie went to a very specific master's program at WVU. Some of those student-run sites have been hosted on the same servers since the 90s. Just having a quick glance at one of them, I found news articles and interviews from 2014. I just had to dig further back and look for anything related to her master's, and I might get some kind of insight. I sat there scrolling for the better part of an hour. I'm not much of a phone guy, and the thing was running hot in my sweaty palms. 2013, 2012, 2011. And there she was, Josie Fadden. An article weeks before her graduation in 2011. I could have recognized her a mile away. She had the same dimpled smile. She talked about her master's thesis in invasive plant species and the dangers of unchecked greenhouse gardens.
My favorite is Helianthus cerulea.
The article quoted.
The blue sunflowers remind me of home.
The article noted her working with a local florist to conduct further testing. I took note of the address and name of the owner.
But no matter how pretty it is, it must be contained.
The article concluded.
Locked away.
This lit a fire. I had a lead. I made a couple of calls and got a few names. The name of the florist led to the name of the current owner. They, in turn, referred me to an ex-employee who'd worked with Josie. They, in turn, referred me to one of her old classmates. I didn't get a number, but I got an address to a greenhouse just outside of town where they worked. It was better than nothing. About an hour later, I'd made my way to the greenhouse. It was this large, cylinder-shaped plastic building stretching across the parking lot. The thing was bigger than anticipated. Then again, I'd never been to one before. They were about to close when I walked in, but I couldn't see anyone matching the description I'd gotten. His name was Mark Burton. About my age, thick glasses, thin as a twig. Had a bit of a New England accent. I stopped to ask one of the gardeners, an older woman with a kind smile.
Mark?
She frowned.
Oh, I'm sorry to have to tell you this.
Another dead end. This time, literally. Mark Burton had died a few years ago. Apparently, he'd asphyxiated from an allergic reaction. The old woman sat me down to tell me all about Mark. She had a lot of fond memories of him, and his sudden death had affected her a lot. Apparently, one of her coworkers had found him.
Right down there.
She said, pointing across the greenhouse.
Back where we used to keep Helianthus cerulea.
Blue sunflowers.
Ghastly things, aren't they? Lovely smell, though. Reminds me of coconut.
I made my way back to my car and got back on my phone. Clouds had started to gather overhead, drowning the air with the smell of fresh rain. I found some of Mark's old socials, which were still open as a sort of online tombstone. People posting pictures of him and expressing their regret. It was strange to think about. He would have been my age, had he still lived. And I might go the same way if I couldn't find the answers I needed. And there, a picture. Mark, his sister, and Josie Fadden, tagged as Josephine Earle. A new name. That was it. That was her. An hour later, I was parked outside a small black-bricked townhome, the last known address for Josephine Earle. The sky had gone dark with clouds, and the first spatters of rain were tapping on the window. It was hypnotic, lulling me back to sleep, the realization of which sent a shock through me, jolting me awake. I hurried up to the front door, my pulse planting a headache into the back of my cranium. I was too tired to yawn. My hands shook as I rang the doorbell. What was I even expecting? At that point, I didn't know. It took 20 heartbeats for her shadow to move up to the door. The handle turned and light poured out. The smell of coconut. And there she was. It felt so strange seeing her again. I couldn't believe it. She was different, but it was still her. It was Josie, and in another way it wasn't. Then again, I was barely recognizable as well.
Can I help you?
She asked, Josie Fadden. She just looked at me. It took her a few seconds to even register the name and the implication. Finally, she shook her head.
She's not here.
It's you, right? She sighed and looked away. After a deep breath, she met my eyes.
What do you want?
It's complicated. I thought you might be able to help me.
With what?
The sunflower room. Josie, or Josephine, had stepped back. She unlocked the door and opened it wide. It was strange to see her like this. I'd never seen her frown. Then again, I'd only known her that one night so many years ago.
Let's talk.
She invited me in and offered me a cup of tea. We sat down in her living room, and she refused to look me in the eye. She was visibly nervous, shaking about as bad as I did. Do you remember me? I asked.
Sorry, no.
She said, shaking her head.
But we must have met.
Yeah, I nodded. A few years back.
So I told you about the sunflower room,
She sighed.
the white door, and the field
Where you plant your worries, and they turn blue.
Those plants are native to my hometown, you know. Ever been to Tomskog, Minnesota?
Never heard of it.
Few have.
I sipped my tea, fruity. I want to know what's happening to me. I keep thinking about that place.
And it hurts you, doesn't it? I think I can see a rash there.
It does. Josie finished her tea and put the cup down on the glass coffee table. So why now? I asked. Why me?
It needs new plants.
She shrugged.
If nothing new is planted, the room sort of cannibalizes itself. Hell, it strains itself so much that some seeds make all the way over to our side.
Is that why it's hurting me? Because I haven't planted anything?
Probably.
Then why aren't you affected? Josie got out of her chair and stretched. She turned to me with a smile, but it wasn't the smile I remembered her by.
You have to plant something regularly. At first, it's things you want to get rid of. You plant your worries, your hate, your fear. But after a while, you just have to keep planting. You plant your dreams, your hopes, your loves, even your memories. You just have to keep planting, because if you don't, the room will pull you back in.
And if you don't plant anything?
Then, you.
She shrugged.
What happens to you, happens.
So that's all there's to it? I have to plant things in there?
You have to lose parts of yourself.
She clarified.
Today, it is worries. Tomorrow, the rest.
She took the empty teacup from my hands and placed it on the coffee table.
But you don't have to plant your own things.
She smiled.
As long as you keep planting something.
I could see it now. There was a real difference to her. She had lost so much, everything down to the dimples of her smile and the music in her voice. She was the gray remains of what had once been Josie. Maybe that's why she changed her name, to reflect the change she'd gone through over the years. You lost it, I said. You lost all of it.
So much.
What's even left at this point?
Not much.
She admitted.
But what little I got, I'm gonna keep.
I tried to get out of my chair, but my legs didn't move. I tasted coconut, and my eyes had started moving on their own.
With you, I can plant, what? almost 40 years of hopes, dreams, and thoughts, and at the same time tie up a loose end, I won't have to think about that place ever again. I'll lose nothing more.
But you can't just... I couldn't feel my tongue. Darkness. I felt a faint touch. Gentle hands closing around my throat. And in the dark of my mind, I saw that white door with the brass knocker. It opened itself to me. The thorned tendrils moved aside, welcoming me. The blue sunflowers towered above in a world full of green and blue. A full moon looking down like a looming eye in the sky. The pale woman was there, the one with the smile, and the unblinking eyes. And she turned to me, except this time I recognized her. I dared to look closer. This was Josie, the sum of all her worries, dreams, hopes, and joys. Everything planted, put away, and stored. The little parts that made the whole manifested into this sick-looking creature. She barely had any hair left, and her physique had been stretched and twisted. Her skin had grown pale from years of darkness. She stared at me with wet, unblinking black eyes, and when she looked at me, she did so with recognition and smiled. What we'd had together was there in her. Without a word, she grasped my head with her hands. I could tell she wanted to help. She knew me. She recognized me, and she was regretful. Maybe she hadn't meant for me to come here, to see this. Maybe she had just been a drunk girl sharing a secret. She leaned her head against my shoulder with a gentle purr, then looked me in the eye, and smashed my head against hers as hard as she could. I wasn't dead. This wasn't over. Back in Josephine's townhouse, she was leaning over me, choking me. Suddenly, I jerked back awake, thrusting my head forward. I hit her square on the nose, sending her reeling backwards. You? What the hell did you... She grabbed a cheese knife from an empty plate and got back up. I matched her movements to the best of my ability, but I was falling in and out of consciousness. The next moment, I was back there, looking at the dark eyes of she who'd once been the real Josie. The sunflowers were closing in. Thorns crept up my legs. Josie wasn't giving up on me, but there wasn't much she could do. Finally, she took a step back and rushed me, throwing me forward. Awake, I lunged at Josephine. She stumbled backwards, tripping on the edge of a carpet. She fell backwards, breaking her glass coffee table into 1,000 pieces, cutting herself on the pieces. This time, as I collapsed to the floor, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. And there we were, the three of us, the sunflower room, being mauled by thorns and vivid blue petals. My skin punctured, my flesh stripped, and Josie apologetically tried to comfort me. Was this it? Was this all there was to it? Just pain? Forever?
No!
Cried Josephine.
I buried you.
Josie smiled at me, and I understood. So, you don't get away, not even in death. Josie shook her head. You postpone it, and that's all you can do, whether you plant anything or not, I continued. That's it, isn't it? The thorns didn't seem to bother her. She stroked my cheek gently as Josephine was torn to shreds. You said this place used to be beautiful, I reminisced. Could it be? Josie whispered a secret in my ear as Josephine's vocal cords were stretched and snapped. Countless beings, all twisted manifestations of memories and thoughts buried, stared at me from the dark, all with unblinking eyes. And as the blue sunflowers faded from my mind's eye, and in the dark that remained, I asked a final question. Will I see you again? I woke up on Josephine's floor, coughing up sunflower seeds. A paramedic loomed over me, having driven an EpiPen into my leg. Apparently the neighbors had heard the commotion. I'd killed Josephine. She lay dead on the floor. I'd planted her in the sunflower room. I'd postponed my death. Blood tests found that there were drugs in my system. It was deemed an accidental death from self-defense. You might have seen it in the news, but it was just this local domestic abuse kind of story. A lot of context was lost, and there were bigger news circling the media that month. I'm sort of thankful for it. The real Josie had been buried piece by piece over the years. Josephine was all that remained, and she was desperate not to lose herself further. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I want you to think about this with me. Really think about it. Imagine the white door, an old white wooden door, a brass knocker that's been turning green over the years. The door is segmented into two squares, stacked on top of one another. Try to imagine it. You've probably seen something like it before. And as it opens, it gives way to a field of flowers. Beautiful blue sunflowers in neat rows. There you can bury your worries, your hatred, your ugly thoughts, and the caretakers of that room will care for them forever. Imagine the fresh soil between your fingers and pushing something awful down into it. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? Now, here's the thing. I'm sorry. By telling you about the sunflower room, you become aware. It's a mark that you can't get rid of. It is this fixed idea that will settle and grow. It can change things, plant things, take things. We can all mitigate it by just planting that one thing every now and then. If we all pitch in collectively, I think the effect will be milder. Maybe that place is something we've always had. A heaven or hell, depending on how you see it. Maybe it was there all.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man struggling with life decides to take extreme measures for extra work. So, how did you sleep? Because I haven't slept since 2023.
Growing up, I had two choices in life. I could follow in my father's footsteps as a farm equipment maintenance worker. It was a decent job with decent pay, but I always got this sense of dread whenever I walked by his workshop. It was this big windowless building in a pale green color, and I always had this feeling that if I stayed there for too long, that place would eat me alive. So I went with the other choice in life, my mother. She was always larger than life, and she wanted me to be too. She was all about the hustle. When she and my father went separate ways, she took me and my sister across the country to Bangkok. She was the embodiment of Aut Priowai Kinwan, roughly translated to endure the sourness and enjoy the sweetness later. She would take any job at any time and claw her way upward. So my sister and I turned out the same. We would work, study, and socialize. We were supposed to be everything at once, smart, strong, cultural, and opinionated. I studied computer science at night and worked delivery during the day. I got a pretty good eye for traffic, so I can make it around the city without fearing for my life. That's easier said than done. Traffic laws around here seem to be more of a suggestion rather than law. I also did the odd job making websites for friends, family, and acquaintances. That would eat up most of my weekend nights. And finally, the one job that never paid me anything, looking out for my sister. My sister Zara worked as a club and event promoter in the inner city. She mostly worked weekends and nights, and I'm the only one she trusts to watch her back. If someone bothered her, I'd be on call. If she needed a sudden ride home, I'd be on call. I'd get yelled at for being late, or for not responding fast enough, or for 1,000 different reasons. It was, by far, the worst job I'd ever had. But family's family. I would be working so much that the only time my friends would see me was when I came around to pick up Isara. They started to call me Elik, or Lurk, something you say when it's time to close for the night. I was the closing time guy. When I showed up, it was time to go home. Not the most fun nickname to be stuck with in your early 20s. When my mother passed from pancreatic cancer in 2020, I just turned 21. I was put in a position where I had to support both myself and my sister economically. Sure, she pulled part of her weight too, but she was looking ahead. She wanted to work in cosmetology, especially in movies and TV shows. That would take money and time. So for a while there, I had a lot of sudden weight put on my shoulders. Studies, work, more work, and being there for Isara. I barely slept, and when I did, I'd wake up at the slightest sound. I was so used to sleeping lightly, waiting for my sister to call for a pickup. But I didn't have a lot of choice. I had to keep going for everyone's sake. So I made a plan. I just had to make it until I was done with my studies. I looked for temporary solutions. I'd take caffeine pills, but they ended up giving me a stomach ache. I tried this dextrose drink from a local pharmacy, but that thing almost gave me arrhythmia. I didn't want to try any heavier stuff, so I kind of gave up hope. Then I met a guy named Samyot. Samyot is a nice guy in the wrong kind of business. About 10 years older than me, but 30 years older at heart. To this day, I'm not sure what he really does, apart from co-managing a couple of downtown clubs. I think he buys things from places you shouldn't. Some kind of gray area importer. He was a part owner of a club where Asara worked on the weekend. The first time I met him, he was sitting outside the club with a cold beer, having a cigarette. He didn't look like the owner, so I sat down next to him to tie my shoes. He looked me up and down.
You just gonna sit down like that?
He asked.
You got an appointment?
I need an appointment for a chair?
For my chair, yeah.
You the boss?
I'm a boss, yeah.
I was too tired to care, and frankly, getting my sister fired from that place would have made my life easier. So I looked right back at him. You don't look like a boss to me. I didn't know if he was going to hit me or hire me, but he ended up belly laughing, offering me a cigarette, so I guess I made the right choice. I would spend about 1 or 2 nights a week at Samyot's club. He'd offer me a job, but the pay was awful, and I was busy with other things. I literally didn't have enough hours of the day to work for him. I think that was for the best, though. He was a great guy to hang out with, but he must have been an awful boss. Cheap bastard. Samyot had some sympathy for me, though. I was working hard to make ends meet. He respected the hustle. He offered me a couple of side gigs. For example, picking up leftover credit cards at ATMs. There's a kind of ATM that takes a long time for the card to come back out. So a lot of tourists think it ate them, so they leave the card behind. Samyot paid a little for each card I could bring him, so I would walk around and pick them up while waiting for Isara to finish work. Every little bit helps. We developed a good friendship. I would show up an hour or so before Isara needed a pickup, just to hang out with Samyot. We'd usually just talk about movies, cars, girls, whatever came to mind. I didn't have a lot of people in my life I could just talk to about nothing, and I don't think he did either. We'd usually end up having a beer and chew beetle nuts. They're these nuts that you wrap in a leaf and chew. It gives you a pick-me-up that makes your mouth burn. It sums up Samyot pretty well, legal but spicy. But things took a turn when I was invited to a private party of his. See, I'd been up for 27 hours straight at that point. I'd been working on a large project for my computer science class, and I'd been trying to get a couple of extra hours in at the delivery company. That, and a client needed me to redo their homepage after it got hacked. It was a perfect storm of a lot of little things all at once, and it drove me to exhaustion. But I still got to Samyot's party. He had a nice place outside of town. He'd invited some people from the club and some business associates. He had these parties about once every 6 months or so. It was a way to show appreciation and brag of it. Still, Samyot had pulled out all the stops. He'd felt sorry for me, seeing me work so hard, and he'd brought a guy there from a research institute. They needed people for a data entry job, and he thought it'd be my kind of thing. Problem is, I was so tired I looked like I was on drugs. I didn't even understand the guy was offering me a paid position. As the party died down, Samyot took me aside and sat me down for a chat. We chewed some beetle nuts, and he took off his sunglasses. The man didn't look me in the eyes a lot, so I knew something was up.
I worry about you,
He said.
You're working too hard.
I'm sorry, I said. It's not that I don't appreciate this, but I had so much to do.
Then tell me.
He continued.
Tell me how I can help.
You don't need to do anything, I said. I'm just glad to have a friend, you know? I could see the wheels turn in his head. His eyes welled up a little. He gave me a hug and took me out to the veranda overlooking the city. He patted me on the back.
You deserve better.
He said.
I'll get you something better.
The following weekend, I got a text from Samyot. He was excited to show me something. He usually had something to share, but this time seemed different. I was a bit anxious about seeing him, but it was a nice change of pace. So that Saturday, I was invited into the club. I went straight past the bouncer, through the dance floor, and into the back room. From there, I followed a corridor to a small office at the back of the building. After all I'd seen from Samyot, I expected something grander, but it was just a little office with an old laptop, a USB fan, a couple chairs, and a shitty TV in the corner. All accentuated by a couple of early 2000s posters of women in bikinis posing with cars. Samyot was smiling ear to ear and waved me over. He opened a safe under his desk and pulled out a small box of white pill bottles. They were all sealed and unmarked, except for a small blue sunflower print on the cap. He sat me down and took a bottle out of his pocket to show me.
This is gonna help.
He said,
Trust me.
"I don't do drugs, boss."
I know you don't. This isn't that.
He showed me his phone and a conversation he'd had with the guy from the party, the one from the Research Institute. Apparently, he'd managed to get his hands on a couple of cases of an off-market stimulant.
I tried it myself, he said. Going on 2 weeks now. It's a little miracle.
What does it do? What's the catch?
No need to sleep anymore.
He smiled.
1 pill, you're good for at least 18 hours.
No way.
You might need another hour or 2 to recover when you finally go to bed. But apart from that, it's perfect. Doesn't make your piss smell, doesn't fuck up your hair, nothing.
No way, I repeated. Too good to be true. Somyat sat down at his desk across from me, giving me a long look.
You won't let me get you a better job.
He said.
Let me get you this, as a friend.
I could tell he was being genuine. You could say a lot about Somyat, but he'd always been honest with me. I swallowed my fears and picked up one of the pills. I don't know, I said. There's got to be a catch.
Never more than 1 a day,
He said.
or you'll get sick. And no more than 2 days at a time, maybe 3. But then you'll probably get a headache. Oh, and no drugs.
What do you mean?
There's a list of things drugs it reacts with, but you don't do that stuff, so you're good.
What about caffeine?
As long as you don't pour stuff like,
Somyat picked up a small piece of paper and looked it over, reading from a list.
R-choline, cocaine, hydrochloride, diacetylmorphine, or methamphetamine. You're good.
There goes my Friday night,
Funny.
Somyat scoffed.
If you don't want it, it's fine, but
No, I'll try one. And so I did. Taking that first pill was like breathing in after a deep dive. I felt lighter, but not high. I was just well rested, ready to take on the day. But there was also a slight chill to it, like a cold breath sweeping across my nerves. I looked at Somyat like I was seeing him for the first time. He got up and slapped his hands together with a grin.
I knew it.
He said,
I knew this'd be it.
How much? I asked. For a bottle. And how much?
Take it.
He smiled, taking over the whole case.
Guy owed me a favor.
Really, you're just giving it away?
I'm just glad to have a friend.
That night was the first time I stuck around to party with Somyat. For real. The man was a force of nature. He downed shots like they were water. He knew all the best food vendors on the block by name, and he'd ping-pong from after party to after party without breaking a sweat. I was just along for the ride. We ended up drunk on a bench, watching the sunrise. Not a blink of tiredness in our eyes. Our day was just getting started. No need for beetle hunts to keep us going. I wouldn't need those ever again.
Next, you're getting a woman.
He murmured.
Then a job. A great job.
You can fix anything, huh?
That's why I'm the boss.
I don't want to owe you anything, I said. You get that, right?
You don't owe me anything.
Kind of feels like I do. He asked me to show him my phone. I did, and he scrolled down to his number on the contact list. He tapped it, hovering his finger over the delete button.
You can delete me today and never call me again. And that's up to you.
Really?
Really.
He handed me the phone back and turned his attention to the sun.
But for as long as you feel like it, I'm here.
He continued.
No strings.
No strings. He shrugged and slid his final beer my way.
It's just nice to be the good guy for once.
The next night, lying in my bed, I was scared. I had no idea how my body would respond. It was a make or break moment where I'd find out if Somyat had screwed me over or if he'd really helped me out. I had a whole case of those pills stashed away in the closet, more than enough to keep me going for months. But I took his advice. Every 2 or 3 days or so, I'd give it a rest. So when I went to sleep that night, I didn't know what to expect. I had strange dreams. I dreamt I woke up in this barren world with a dead tree towering in the distance. There were no stars in the sky. It was desolate but peaceful in a way. And I dreamt that there was someone there in the dark, someone looking for me. But I woke up long before they found me. I was a bit worked up, but it was just a dream. Those fleeting images rolled out of my mind faster than it took for me to make breakfast. From that moment on, I decided to give these things a go. I would rest every 3 days or so, but until then I was constantly on the go. I could work as many hours as I wanted. I could be up all night, finishing projects left and right. I never missed a call from Zara. I could keep up with demands, and I could do it comfortable, without side effects. Sure, whenever I crashed, I'd dream about that place again. The dead tree, reaching for the moon, the desolate ruins, and somewhere, out in the eternal night, something was looking for me. But it never had the time to find me. I'd always wake up long before it did. It was comfortable, efficient, and I could do it all. I had time to work a little with Samyat. Not anything big, just odd jobs here and there. He was fair, but didn't pay much. But then again, I was making more money than I knew how to spend. I got a second chance at an interview with Samyat's guy at the Research Institute, and that time around, I nailed it. It was just a low-level data entry job, but I could do it remotely, and it paid almost twice as much as my delivery job. I had to brush up on my English, but that wasn't a big deal. Isara and I had to learn it early on in our lives. My mother made sure of it. Isara had saved up enough money for her cosmetology classes, so I got some more time to focus on other things. I invested some time in a startup app with some guys from my classes, and we made some solid progress. Overall, things looked pretty good. Weeks turned to months, and months eventually turned to an entire year. I still had plenty of pills left, and I got into a healthy routine. I slept better, I ate better, and I had so much more time on my hands. It got to the point where I couldn't imagine going back to life without those pills. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what that place in between, the wakeful world and my dreams was. That place in the starless night, with the dead tree in the distance. Who were the dark shapes roaming the fields of black sand, and who was out there looking at me? I wouldn't think about it too much. I chalked it up as a weird side effect, but not much else. It didn't affect my everyday life, so why should I care? Fast forward to 2023. I was co-owner of a small company, no more data entry. We had an office and 5 employees. My nickname still stuck around, but it was more or less sarcastic. I was no longer the guy who showed up at the end of it all. I was the first in line. I would plan my come-downs in a way that people never noticed. I had this reputation of working around the clock, and people just couldn't figure it out. I didn't share my secret with anyone. I figured there would be some serious consequences if those pills got in the wrong hands. My sister worked, got a nice job at one of the local malls. One of the really big ones, not just any old mall. It was very well paid. She could support herself more than enough. She ended up moving in with the guy, and I got a place of my own. I could finally take a step up and get myself something nice. I still spent time with Samyat. He was the only other person in the world that knew of the pills. He'd stopped taking them, though. He found them too distracting when it came to keeping a schedule. He was going steady with a lady named Wanwan, and he hated seeing her go to bed on her own. It was surprisingly sweet. And more pills for me, so win-win. In February of 2023, my sister got married. It was bad timing since I had a huge project to work on at the time. So even with all my available time, it was still not enough. So I had to do something Samyat advised against. I had to keep going for 5 days straight, just 2 days more than the ordinary 3, but still. Now, I didn't immediately notice anything. It worked just fine. But when I finally crashed, after almost a full week without sleep, I had the most awful nightmare of my life. Not only was I back there in that desolate space, I could feel it. The black sand creeping into my shoes. The howling of people in pain. I thought I heard gunfire, too. What little vegetation lived there was twisted into a midnight blue, just like the blue sunflower on the cap of the bottle. But this time, there wasn't just something in the dark looking for me. No, it was hunting. I have this vivid memory of crawling through the sands of an old ruin, hearing something closing in. Despite the sand, it was wet, viscous. It made this disgusting sound, like a crowd of large men struggling for breath all at once. I would hear it touch its way across the ruins, looking for me, and everywhere it touched, something sizzled, like burning acid. It tried to speak. I know it did, but it couldn't. It had too many tongues, and they all tried to speak at once. Eventually, it found me. I couldn't look. I couldn't breathe. I could feel the size of it without even looking as it loomed over me. I tried making myself small, but it didn't matter. It sighed like it had enjoyed a cold glass of water on a warm summer's day. It was so pleased to find me. And as it moved closer, I heard something dripping, sizzling into the sand. There was a powerful smell of ammonia and something akin to mothballs. It touched my arm, and it burned into my skin. It burned so bad that I woke up. And when I did, I had a burn. A coin-sized black mark, gangrenous flesh tightening the skin of the arm, stinging with every flex of my triceps. That place was real. That thing had been real. For a full week after that, I kept feeling like I'd been seconds from death. I had a doctor check out my arm, but couldn't make sense of it. It was an acid burn, but it behaved like a frostbite. In the end, he had to make a small procedure to remove the necrotized skin, but it was overall fine. I just had to keep it clean and bandaged, and be prepared for a nasty scar. But that thing had been so vivid. Days later, I could still smell it. I remember this one time when I was taking a shower, when I had to turn off the water. I thought I heard something sizzling in the other room. Wrapped in a towel, I peeked through the door, hoping against hope that I was just being paranoid. That time, I was. But what about next time? I swore off the pills. I was in a good place, and I didn't need them. I'd gained everything I wanted. Sure, it'd take some time to get back to a normal schedule, but I couldn't go back there. No wonder we weren't supposed to take more than 2 or 3 pills in a sequence. If I'd been there a second longer, it would have taken my whole arm. Another hour, and I'd be dead. I decided to give it all back to Somno. By that time, he had expanded his business a bit, but he'd calmed down as a person. He was a changed man. He was engaged to Wanwan, and he was trying to turn his life around. In fact, we hadn't seen each other for some time. He was a bit surprised when I called about meeting him in his office. I met Somyot in his downtown office late one Friday night. It was a strange feeling. There were people everywhere, but I still felt like I was alone. There was this thought crawling around in the back of my head, whispering to me that if I slowed down and really listened, I could hear that sizzling acid as it burned into the asphalt. So I kept my head down and tried to get into the music, the bass, the beat of the party. But it was all just superficial. I couldn't help but think back on that thing. Every time I heard a cough, a sneeze, someone clearing their throat, I thought that was it. It found me. I could feel the squelch of it in my ear, almost like a heat. But I made my way through the club and joined Somyot in his office. I put the pills on his desk and sat down across from him. "I'm done with them," I said.
They do something to you?
He asked. "Yeah," I said. I'm done."
All right, no worries.
Somyot nodded.
You okay?
Not really. Despite not hanging out for a while, Somyot was his usual self. He put the pills away, sat down next to me, and handed me a beer. He'd installed a mini fridge next to his desk. The damn thing made more noise than his ceiling fan.
I'm not gonna ask about it,
He said.
You look like shit.
"I feel like shit."
What happened to your arm?
"Frostbite?" Somyot snorted, but saw that I wasn't laughing. He opened his mouth, but closed it again. Whatever had happened to me, he knew better than to laugh. Instead, he leaned over, looking worried.
Fuck the pills,
He said.
You're sticking with me now, all right?
"All right." He made his best effort to keep me company that night. We had drinks, met some people, and sang some karaoke. I almost got into an arm wrestling competition with a drunk Dutch guy. It was nice, and for a moment, I didn't hear those awful noises. I didn't smell those smells. Later that night, I could feel myself growing tired. Usually, I would pop one of the pills, but I settled for a classic instead, beetle nuts. Somyot and I wrapped them up and bit down. It was nice to feel that familiar crunch and burn. It was a return to form, in a way. It was the way things were supposed to be. By the end of the night, we ended up on that same bench, watching the sun. But this time, he was exhausted. He was nodding off over and over as he waited for a friend to pick him up. I was strangely not tired in the slightest.
Maybe you still got some of it in your system.
Somyot mumbled.
Makes sense, right? Bigger doses take longer.
Probably, I nodded. Or maybe it was the nuts.
Nah, they don't work like that. They're a kick, not a trip.
By the time Somyot's friend came around to pick him up, he could barely keep his eyes open. He lumbered into the passenger seat and looked back at me one final time.
I'm getting rid of them.
He said,
Don't worry, it's done. You'll be fine.
but I wasn't feeling fine, or rather, I was. But that was the problem. I went home and I still couldn't sleep. I went an entire day and I still couldn't sleep. I hadn't taken any pills for some time, but I was still up and about. I was getting worried, but I didn't know where to turn. Had I taken a pill by accident? I reached out to Somyot's contact at the Research Institute, but we couldn't talk about it over email since it was monitored, and this was hardly legal. So we decided to meet downtown later in the week. For the next few days, I was a wreck. I kept thinking about that place and that thing. I'd been up for so many days that I didn't want to think about what would happen when I returned. It would be waiting for me. I could feel it, hear it. I met the man from the Research Institute an early morning. I paid for his coffee, but I didn't get any myself. He was an American in his 50s, with a shaved head and a well-trimmed goatee. He hid behind a black baseball cap and wasn't much for small talk. I decided to get right to it. I explained the problem. After taking a larger than usual dose, I couldn't sleep anymore. He didn't look that surprised.
That only happens when you take stimulants.
He said,
Didn't he warn you?
I haven't taken anything, I said. I don't do drugs.
You sure?
He asked,
Nothing?
does alcohol count? I asked. Betel nuts? Caffeine?
What? No, that...
He stopped for a second. His eyes turned away as he thought about it. He brought out his phone and checked something, then nodded.
Betel nuts.
He repeated.
That's high in arecoline.
High in what?
Arecoline. That's the first thing on the list. That's the worst one.
Wait, what? He adjusted his glasses and read the list out loud. He was right. Aircline was the first thing on the list. Right there, next to hard narcotics. What does it mean? What's gonna happen? He leaned back in his chair, sipped his coffee, and adjusted his glasses.
We made this in our lab back in Vietnam. When the lab got shut down, it was scheduled to be burned, but we never got around to it.
So you make drugs? Is that it?
It's not a drug.
He explained.
It isolates a particular chemical element. It was originally made to nurture a type of deep sea fish, to gestate a kind of rough metal powder.
What? Fish? I don't...
Look, it's not a stimulant. It's not a drug. It puts a part of you in another place. And while it's there, your body becomes disconnected from a few of your basic needs. In most cases, sleep.
So what does it mean? What's gonna happen to me? He leaned forward, looking over the edge of his silver-rimmed glasses.
Arecoline amplifies the effect by a magnitude of about 100. It's one of the reasons they had to shut down the development. At that magnitude, there's no telling what's gonna happen.
Wait, 100? So I'm going to...
You're gonna be awake for maybe a year, maybe 4. And then something I can't even imagine is going to happen to you.
There was nothing else to say. He had no advice to give, there were no solutions. The damage was done. I almost burst into tears right then and there. My hands were shaking. I would be awake for years, and then something he couldn't even imagine. If the effect of 2 pills too many caught me a burn on the arm, what the hell was going to happen after 100? 200? The bandage itched, and I could hear the sizzling from a nearby kitchen. But it wasn't from the kitchen, it was that thing. And it was waiting for me. It was just a matter of time. I tried everything, but there was nothing to be done. There was nothing wrong with me on paper. I was healthier than ever, in fact. The lab in Vietnam that the man spoke of had been shut down, and all traces of it was dismantled. I had a vague lead to an investor in the US, but it didn't lead me anywhere. I had to sell my share of the company. It stung, but the payout was more than generous. It would keep me afloat for a couple of months, maybe a year, while I tried to work something out. But it was a desperate search for nothing. Even the man from the Research Institute would drop off the grid. And when strange men in suits started asking my friends and family about me, I knew I'd taken a step too far. This was in February 2023. Every day from that point forward has been a nightmare. In May that same year, I lost the need to eat. It's like my body entered a kind of metastasis. I could sit in a room for days on end, staring at a wall, and nothing would change. I would feel nothing. I would experience nothing. And I wouldn't care. And with no food, I'd need no bathroom breaks. Sometime in July, I lost the need to breathe. I would forget to do it for days on end, and my lungs would deflate to the point where it hurt to use them. After a couple of weeks, I couldn't talk without bleeding anymore. In late October that year, I stopped blinking. I would forget to do it for long periods of time, and dust would settle in my eyes. It didn't hurt, but it was uncomfortable to wash them, so I just ended up keeping them closed. Something happened to my skin. I think it stopped needing sunlight. Over a couple of days, I grew so pale, you could almost see through me. My fingernails would fall off. Without using my mouth and jaw, my teeth fell out of my skull. I barely noticed. I had to move in with my sister to care for me. She couldn't understand what was happening, and neither could anyone else. She would force me to go to the doctors, and they couldn't make sense of it. Whenever they mentioned specialists, some anonymous group would throw enough money at them to look the other way. But all of that was just cake topping. It was all just physical things. It didn't compare to my thoughts and feelings. I would feel closer and closer to that dark place. That space beyond where that thing waited for me. It hungered for me. All the needs and wants I'd lost, it had gained. It was hungry, tired, sunburned, and in constant pain. And it wanted to give it all back to me, to consume me with it. If I just listened hard enough, I could hear it panting, like an eager dog waiting for master to put food in his bowl, ready to tear into me unashamed. Sometimes I forget what world I'm in. I'll get up and wander around, feeling the walls, imagining them as crumbling ruins. My sister once caught me wandering into the street. If my lungs had worked, she would have heard me begging that thing to leave me. Instead, I got hit by a car, and I didn't feel a thing. Laying crumbled into a pile by the side of the road, the things people say feel like a distant dream. I have no need for serotonin, so joy is something of the past. Sometimes I can hear the music and cheering across the city, but it feels like they're mocking me. But the fear, that's still there. It may be the only emotion that remains. Now it's 2025. I think I attended Samyat's wedding, but I can't know for sure. I think I was there. I didn't see or hear. I can't feel anything when I move my arms anymore. There was a nice smell. I think he offered me some cake. I tried to smile at him, but I don't know if I did it. I've written this with great effort over several weeks. My sister has helped. She washes my eyes, and I would look at the letters for her to type. If I stretch a little, I can get enough air in my lungs to make a noise or a short word. Sometimes at night, when my sister's not here, I think I can hear something outside. Not just in my mind, but on the street. I think they are watching me. I think they're curious about what happens when I got to sleep. Or maybe they're scared. It's funny in a way. They called me Lurk. Closing time. It's fitting. I can't help but think I should have stayed with my father, maintaining farm equipment. I wish I could dream of seeing those pale green walls again. I had to finish this in a hurry. I think the effect is wearing off.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a woman struggling with being different is terrorized by someone leaving items at her apartment's door. So, did you order something? Because if not, why do I see? The many bags outside my door.
I've always had a bit of a victim complex. I grew up in a small town, and I was pretty much the only kid in class who didn't have any siblings. I always felt outnumbered, and I didn't have many friends to share my thoughts with. I spent most days in my room, reading, or locked in a bathroom stall. In my teenage years, not much changed. I tried to express myself. I went through a goth phase, a witch phase, a hippie phase, and finally settled on a mishmash of all three. Even though I've grown less colorful over the years, I still pride myself on my aesthetic. It made me quite a few enemies, though. They say kids can be cruel, but some adults are just big kids. But even though I've looked different over the years, I've still had that feeling of being different, of being a target, outnumbered and misunderstood. I got the bruises to show for it. Well, I had. I went to college, moved out of state, met a guy, got left by said guy, and here I am, a decade later. Not much to say. Still have a tattoo of a pink pentagram on my wrist, though, even though it just looks transparent nowadays. But it's there. I'm still here. Still me. And I still have that uneasy feeling of being a target. Like I'm next in line for something awful. My life came to a halt when I witnessed a car crash. I was waiting for the light to turn green when a truck plowed into the side of a car just across the road. It was so violent. You can't understand the force behind that kind of collision until you witness it firsthand. Steel bending like sheets of paper. It really underlines how fragile we are. Thinking back on it still makes me feel like nothing but a bag of blood, ready to burst at the slightest touch. My first reaction was to get out of there. I didn't want to be in the way when the ambulance came, and there was already people running up to help. I admit, I felt like a coward. But there was just something strange about the whole thing. They pulled someone out of the car, rather violently, and I could hear screams. I just left. My anxiety got the better of me. But I wonder if I could have done something more. Something meaningful. I don't think so, but still. It changed me in a way. Suddenly, I got more aware of my surroundings, and I started looking for danger at every corner. Instead of crossing a road, I'd just stand there, lost in my own thoughts. I'd start noticing strangers, and I started meeting the eyes of anyone looking in my direction. I got confrontational, and honestly, really hard to spend time with. I was back to my teenage self, outnumbered and expecting trouble. A few days after the accident, as I was coming home from a late shift, I noticed a paper bag outside my door. I share an entrance with another apartment, so I figured she'd ordered something home. I didn't think that much about it, so I just went inside. Still, as I closed my front door, I got the sense that there was something eerie about that bag. It looked a bit frumpy. I had trouble sleeping that night. It felt like every time I was about to nod off, I could imagine someone knocking on my door. I could feel a presence, and it was standing right there, just outside my door. I knew it was there, even if it wasn't. Maybe it followed me home. Of course, it was nonsense. But that didn't slow my racing pulse, and I was still twisting and turning in a pool of my own sweat. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I ran into my neighbor. The bag was still there, waiting outside our shared front door. She was my age, but looked 10 years younger. We shared a good morning and an awkward glance at the bag.
Yours?
She asked. No, I thought...
No.
She shook her head.
So?
We sighed in unison. She picked up the bag and peeked inside as a puff of tiny flies exploded. The bag hit the ground like a ripe watermelon. I picked it up and hurried over to the trash bin, waving the flies away. There was something red and black inside, mostly flies.
Great.
She sighed.
Just great. Fantastic.
You okay? Yeah, just keep an eye open. I don't want to see more bags.
Yeah, same.
It pushed my paranoia to another level. I had this uneasy feeling all day at work, like something was coming for me. I didn't answer any calls, and I barely spoke at the weekly meeting. I imagined people were looking at me funny, like there was something wrong with me. They didn't, but it felt like they did. My boss came in to talk to me in private just to check what was up. Honestly, I couldn't explain myself. We just agreed I should take a few days off. I had some sick days saved up. I got home early that afternoon, only to find another bag outside my door. I tensed up and looked around. Not a soul on the street. The bag was closed. My neighbor wasn't home yet, so I stepped up and poked it open. No flies this time, it must have been placed recently. Again, there was something dark and red. It smelled foul, and it stuck to the sides of the bag. I thought I could see pieces of bone. With the tip of my fingers, I lifted it. The bag was so soaked that the bottom of it collapsed, spilling a red mess all over the porch. It looked like some sort of meat. Tendons sticking out randomly, hacked to pieces. Muscle, sinew, a bit of bone. There was no way to tell what it had been, but I could tell that it wasn't made for eating. It was just a hot mess. It took me 20 minutes to clean it up. I was on my hands and knees, scrubbing until I was sore. I brought out every chemical I had and a bunch of trash bags. I couldn't help the feeling that I was doing something wrong, like I was cleaning up a crime scene. Maybe I was. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed up sitting by the window, listening. I even went to the bathroom with the door open so I could hear if someone was messing with the front door. I couldn't relax, shower, or eat. My mind kept taking me back to that accident and how I watched it grow smaller in the rearview mirror. And sitting there, alone in my apartment, I couldn't help but feel that I was one rearview mirror away from seeing something I didn't want to see. I considered that this bag might have been meant for my neighbor, but all in all, it didn't seem plausible. I had always been the victim. Why would this be any different? I must have fallen asleep somewhere around 5 a.m. I woke up around noon, leaning against the wall, holding a kitchen knife. My back was stiffer than the floor I'd been sitting on, and it took my eyes a full minute to adjust to the light peeking through the blinds. I had held the knife so tight it left ridges in the palm of my hand and my fingers ached. I had a few days off work, and I decided I'd use them. The next time they came to leave a bag by the door, I'd catch them. That was unless... An awful thought made my stomach churn. I put my hand on the front door. It felt like I'd squashed a spider and was about to check if it was dead. That moment of hesitation and knowing you're about to see something twisted. It filled me, made my hands feel weak. I barely even thought about holding the kitchen knife. It became a part of me. And there it was again. A bigger bag this time, and soaked all the way through with red. It smelled awful, like it hadn't been cleaned properly. It was fresh, raw, and steaming. Wherever it came from, it had died recently. I thought about calling the police, but there was that gnawing doubt in me. What if it was human? What would they say? What would happen to me? Even if it was just a small chance, I couldn't risk it. I couldn't put myself in that chair. Then again, not calling the police probably made me an accomplice. But then again, my neighbor didn't call them either. But she wasn't the victim. These were the thoughts that rushed through my head. I didn't even notice I was hyperventilating. I grabbed a shovel and picked the bag up. I didn't even look inside. I knew it was bad. As I opened the trash bin, I stopped for a second. It might just have been my panicking lizard mind, but there was this strange feeling coming down my arm. There was a second pulse, moving from the bag through the shovel. I could feel it in my hands. There was still something living in that bag. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. I wasn't proud of what happened next. I threw the bag to the ground, smashing it repeatedly with my shovel. I hit it over and over, splitting it with the sharp side and clubbing it with the flat side. It took me a full 20 seconds to realize my neighbor, who'd called in sick, was standing in her doorway watching me. I'd just destroyed her lunch. A burger, some fries, chili mayo dressing. There was no blood, no pulse, nothing awful. The only red was ketchup. What the hell was wrong with me? There was an uncomfortable conversation, and I paid for her lunch. When I came back to my apartment and locked the door, I just broke into pieces. I cried, face down on the couch. I felt like the world was getting to me, and I couldn't help but feel like I was losing it. I crawled under a blanket. I could feel something outside my door, something watching me through the windows. They were already inside, and they were waiting to attack. Everywhere, nowhere, waiting. My stomach churned, and I couldn't do anything but cry myself into a painful sleep. I stayed on the couch, falling in and out of sleep over the next few hours. I don't even remember putting on the TV for company. I kept having stressful dreams in that twilight land of half asleep and half panicking. But somewhere around 8 p.m., a cold wind woke me up. My front door was open. Of course I'd closed it. I'd locked it. I always did. But what if I didn't? Was I getting worked up over nothing? Number maybe? I just stood there frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. The door was open. For real. There was a cold wind sweeping through the apartment. I closed and locked the door a few times just to feel the sensation in my hands. It was real. Once the cold wind died down, I felt something. A strange, familiar smell. Warm. I checked the bathroom. Spotless. Kitchen? Nothing. Finally, I stepped into my bedroom. I put my finger on the light switch. It was sticky. I hesitated. The room felt warm. One breath at a time. That's all I had to do, take one breath at a time. And yet, I couldn't.
Do you like it?
It was just a whisper in the wind. I felt a creeping warmth behind me. Something large, heaving. Excited body hairs brushing against the back of my head.
Do you like my gift?
It was so careful, so bright. Like the voice of a wind chime, every consonant sending splinters of ice up my spine. My body shifted, and it took my entire strength of will not to dash towards the nearest window. My feet were sticky, and something warm seeped into my socks.
Bless me.
It had a dry mouth. I could hear it wet its lips. It was so close and so still. I nodded. Yes, I whispered back. In the blink of an eye, it was gone. It was as if a wall behind me had suddenly disappeared. It disoriented me, and out of instinct, I turned on the lights. I only caught a glimpse of it as it closed the front door. A pale, clawed hand, yellow eyes, a smile. The light coming from my bedroom was red. I held my breath as I turned around, and whatever little air I had saved up turned into screams and sobs. I could go into detail about the remains of 6 people scattered around my bedroom. I could go into detail about the police report and the weeks of investigations that turned my apartment into a crime scene. But I won't. These weren't victims of violent crimes. They were corpses taken from the local morgue. Some fresher than others. The organs recovered from the bags I'd thrown away were identified as human of unknown origin and deer stomach. On paper, the motive is unclear. There are no suspects. And there are already rumors that I'm in some kind of satanic cult. I have a pink pentagram on the wrist, after all, and the pink has long since faded. I don't know much about my secret admirer. I don't know why they tried to gain my favor. But I have this gnawing feeling that this explains something about me. Maybe there's a reason why I feel like I'm in the crosshairs. In the mornings, my neck feels light, as if I've dreamt about carrying a burden on my head. At times, I no longer feel like a victim. Instead, I have this sensation that all those eyes in the dark are looking up to me, that they're waiting for me to speak, that I'm one stray wish away from literally tearing the community apart. It scares me how quickly I'm getting used to the idea.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a woman moving into a new place gets more than she bargained for, when her reality becomes surreal. So I don't know how I found it, because it came from my wallpaper.
I got a job in San Diego not too long after the pandemic settled. It was an exciting time, but I was also anxious about finding a place to live. I didn't have that much saved up, so I had to find somewhere a bit more lenient to newcomers. I signed up to all kinds of lists and tenant groups, but most leads were dead in the water. The only places within my price range had a no pets policy, and I couldn't bring myself to rehome my cat Marmalade. Poor thing was just a year old and a complete mama's girl. After weeks of searching, I stumbled upon a landlord with a vacant spot. He hadn't even got the time to list it. All I'd seen was a post about a cheap apartment. I messaged him spontaneously and asked about it. Turns out the previous tenant had passed away. It was on the 4th floor, not too far off Main Street, and surprisingly cheap. Cat-friendly, too. He offered me a deal. If I paid for the cleanup crew, the place was mine. I couldn't say no. Once the place was cleaned up, I met up with my new landlord and got the keys handed to me. My new place was on the top floor of this beautiful old building, made somewhere back in the 50s. Cool, stone-tiled floors, spacious ceiling, and plenty of sunlight coming in from the body-sized windows. There was a sort of French balcony with a little space to smoke, or a mini garden. There was a large living room area, a tiny kitchenette, and a cramped little bedroom on the sunny side. It wasn't much, but I could see myself growing attached to it. You could tell it was old, though. There were all kinds of little quirks. A lock that you had to jiggle, pipes that rumbled a little whenever you took a shower, and you could immediately tell if one of your neighbors were smoking because of the shitty ventilation. It was far from perfect, but for that price, at that location, I couldn't ask for a better deal. The one thing that dated it more than anything else, however, was the strange 70s wallpaper. This intricate floral pattern covered most of the living room, along with the western wall of the bedroom. A dark gray base color with lines of white. Roses, tulips, sunflowers, all in variations of silver and blue. It was beautiful, in a sort of primitive Art Deco kind of way, but you could tell it was old. I promised myself to get it replaced if I were to live there long term. It didn't take long to move in. I didn't have much in the way of furniture, and I didn't really have the money to bring in something new. I figured I'd settle for what little I had for the time being, instead focusing on getting used to my new job. I was working as a full-time consultant for a telecom company, mostly focusing on process management and evaluation. Might not sound that interesting, but you get a lot of wiggle room to really switch things up for the better. Post-pandemic, we were on a routine of a single weekly meeting, and the rest could and would be done from our home office. It felt kind of dumb to force people to come in once a week just because, but if I wanted the job, that was the deal. Marmalade got settled in that place long before I did. She found a sunny spot next to one of the big windows. I set up a cozy basket for her to snuggle into. I, on the other hand, was having trouble sleeping those first few nights. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling. I'd lose myself in that view. Sort of like when you're looking down into dark waters. You can't really see where it ends. It is just this perpetual nothing. And you can imagine it continuing forever. That first week went by in a flash. I had my first meeting and got my first assignment. Process assessment at one of the branch offices in Pittsburgh. Long distance, with an in-person evaluation at the end of a 2-month cycle. Nothing I couldn't handle, but said office had a sort of reputation for being unmanageable. It was the kind of assignment you throw at someone to see if they got the chops for it long term. That first day was mostly meet and greets, with a tiny afterwork at one of the chic downtown bars. It was mostly an excuse to crack a few cold ones on a Monday. My new colleagues were a few decibels louder than I was used to, so I ended up sitting mostly in the background, learning to appreciate a small label dark pumpkin ale. The next day, I was in full work mode. I set up my laptop with a view of my awful wallpaper to make it look a bit more office-like. Marmalade wasn't moving from her new favorite spot by the window, so there were no fluffy tails in the way of my webcam. I had a long talk with the branch manager, along with a few technicians, to just sort of dip my toe in the water. They were all courteous enough, but I could tell they'd been through the ringer a couple of times. This wasn't their first assessment, and it wouldn't be their last. By the end of the day, I was talking with one of the salesmen, a woman named Deirdre. At that point, I'd been in constant Zoom calls for over 4 hours, and my voice was giving out. Deirdre could tell I was exhausted, and we ended up just talking about other things instead. My apartment, my job, my cat. I had to bother Marmalade a bit just to show her off. Deirdre showed off her own feline companion, a 3-year-old ragdoll named Popeye. Ironically, that call ended up being my longest, but it went by the fastest. Deirdre was a gem. I spent most of my time setting up questionnaires and mapping out the overall structure. I was in daily calls, bouncing emails all the way down the supply chain, trying to get a clear picture of the main issues. It was the same old story that I'd heard 100 times before. Management blaming the salesmen blaming the warehouse, and the warehouse blaming the technicians. There were little hitches all the way down the road, ranging from dated inventory systems to useless red tape. After the first few days, I started getting into a routine. Ping-ponging between meetings and Excel spreadsheets, Marmalade and I made that apartment into a proper home. Chinese takeout boxes started lining the kitchenette, and I had a few extra talks with Deirdre just to pass the slow hours. I started getting used to that place, even the awful wallpaper. I stopped hearing the rumbling pipes after a while, and the cigarette smoke from the neighbors slowly blended into the background smells. I stopped waking from cars passing on the streets below, and my first paycheck went into making the living room look like something that could actually be lived in. I remember one night when I was working overtime. I got a late email about submitting a progress report, so I had to stay up making a presentation. I found myself by the opinion that this was looking more and more like a management issue. Who the hell sends that kind of email at 4:50 p.m. on a Thursday, expecting it to be done before lunch the next day? Unbelievable. I was done by about 10 p.m. when I shambled away from my laptop. I picked up a can of cat food for Marmalade and walked over to her favorite window. Only she wasn't there. Her bed was still there, but Marmalade had moved to another window. Still sleeping soundly, but she'd found a new favorite spot. It felt strange in a way, like the entire apartment had shifted a little. Looking up at the wallpaper, I could have sworn the patterns had moved. It looked identical, just a bit off. I could have sworn it was different, despite looking exactly same. It was a strange feeling. Everything felt familiar, but that one little twist made it feel like a new room. I was starting to doubt myself. When looking at Marmalade out of her basket, however, it was clear that something was different, in some way. The next few days, I started to notice this shift in new ways. The walls would look different at night. Where at one point I'd see a sunflower, I'd see a rose the next day. Then again, I wasn't ever really sure, and I chalked it up to me just not paying attention. Marmalade would move from spot to spot, never really sure what her favorite ever was. One night she couldn't settle in at all, instead moving from one window to the next, meowing at me anxiously. That night, as I lay awake, I had my eyes firmly fixed on the wall. I could imagine the patterns moving on their own, the many flowers gently swaying to an invisible wind. It was just that kind of unreal, surrealist thought you catch just before you fall asleep. But in that moment, I could have sworn it was real. Living, even. As I closed my eyes, I imagined the dark gray background color to be as deep as an ocean. A darkness stretching into a distant nothing. The next day, as I was making my morning coffee, I noticed something peculiar. I stepped on a dry blue petal. I couldn't explain where it came from. I had no flowers in my apartment, and the ventilation was so shit that it could barely rotate air. Flower petals were out of the question. Marmalade played with it for a while, and I convinced myself that it was just something I dragged in. Still, it reminded me of a flower petal from the blue roses on the wallpaper. It made me anxious, but I couldn't figure out why. What was I even worried about? I couldn't let that thought go for the rest of the day. That I was missing something obvious, or maybe that there really was something to my strange paranoia. So at the end of the day, when I talked to Deirdre, I brought it up. I explained that there was just something inherently creepy about living there, like an uncomfortable thought tickling your neck when you're not looking. Deirdre tried to reassure me, her chuckle coming through my headphones.
It takes time, love,
she said.
You just got here. Besides, everything looks strange in the dark.
Yeah, I just can't shake the feeling, you know? I explained. Like there's something more to it?
Like what?
I didn't know what to answer. As I stepped into the living room, I noticed Marmalade rolling on the living room carpet, casually playing with another blue petal. Turning on the lights, I could see more of them. Over a dozen dry blue petals lining the edge of the wall. Finally, I could tell I wasn't going crazy. This wasn't a one-time deal. That was real. Marmalade didn't seem to mind, though. I'm gonna have to get back to you, I told Deirdre. Something came up. As the call ended, I started scooping up the petals by hand. The moment my knees hit the floor, there was a power surge. It was all so quick. A flash of black. Marmalade hissed, looking straight past me, and I could hear a rustling noise, like a large animal moving through a bush. As quick as it had come, it went, leaving only a startled cat and my elevated pulse behind. The lights were slapped back on with a click, blinding me. Marmalade retreated to behind the couch while I picked up the rest of the petals. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the many patterns, petals in hand. I could imagine the gray sinking deeper and deeper, showing me something past the obvious. Like one of those images you have to look at cross-eyed to see the truth. I had the same sensation, like I was missing something obvious. I could imagine hearing things deep in an imagined forest. I could hear branches snapping. I could imagine the blue flowers swaying in the wind. And somewhere in all that depthless dark, something roamed. Something looking for an exit. At some point, I snapped to attention. There was a loud electronic noise. An alarm. It was already morning. For some alien reason, I'd been stuck there for hours, just staring at the hypnotizing patterns. An entire night's rest? Gone. It wasn't until I stepped away that I realized just how exhausted I really was. My legs had locked on place, heeling me over straight to the stone-tiled living room floor. Marmalade rushed over, worried about this sudden development. I spent a few minutes just sitting there, calming myself down. The ringing from my cell phone was going strong, trying to give me enough time to shower before my first morning meeting. And yet, I just sat there, slowly petting my cat. My eyes bobbing in and out of sleep, my body deprived. Where had I been all night? What had I seen? I barely made it through that day, having a 45-minute nap over lunch. By the time I finished my last interview, I was a shell of my old self, barely conscious. I filled Marmalade's food and water bowl and crawled into bed with all my clothes still on. The moment my eyes closed, I could hear something in the distance. In the half-world between sleeping and waking, I heard breaking branches, owls taking flight, and something large approaching. And despite I knowing I was well and truly alone, my body screamed at me to wake, to have one more look just in case. I did. I forced my eyes open. Something sharp scratched against the stone-tiled floor, something retreating in haste, a trail of dry petals leading right up to the side of my bed. After a night of dreamless sleep, I woke up to choking on something. It took me almost a full minute to cough up a blue petal, several of which had been sprinkled throughout my bed. I could have sworn the wallpaper looked a bit lighter, as if several flowers were looking sparse. The whole wall looked a bit darker. That morning, I'd had enough. I called in sick and brought out my toolbox. I started scraping off the wallpaper, piece by piece, across the entire apartment. I made a day of it, listening to music as Marmalade looked at me curiously. Every illustrated petal and stem dropped to the floor, cut by cut, like trimming a paper garden. By the end of the day, my wall was laid bare, revealing nothing but black lead-painted concrete underneath. That night, after a long shower, I went to sleep with wallpaper remains still lining the edge of the room. Finally, I could focus. I could look past the hypnotizing patterns. It was done. Gone. Over. Except it wasn't. As I went to sleep, my eyes drifted to the barren walls. A black, eternal night, now unhindered by what little paper-thin barrier had been erected. Just looking at it gave me that feeling in my stomach, like I was falling forward. Even closing my eyes felt brighter than staring into it. Like it was more than a color, a place. At some point in the night, I heard this loud yowl. Looking up, I could see Marmalade sitting at the edge of my bed, staring straight at the wall, hissing and raising her hackles. Looking straight ahead, I saw something. There, deep in the dark of the bare wall, something moved. I swooped up Marmalade, who clung to my shoulder like a parrot. I threw on my pants, shirt, and got my bag. I'd had enough. I wasn't about to stick around to find out the depths of what was either my own insanity or something unnatural entirely. I didn't want to know. As I entered the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Every single wall had turned a midnight black. The windows had fogged up from the inside, blocking the moonlight from peeking in. I ran my hand along the wall, looking for the door. Something cold bumped against the palm of my hand. A finger. I recoiled, almost dropping Marmalade in surprise. I couldn't see my door. As I looked around, trying to find my bearings, I slowly came to the realization that nothing was quite as it should. The kitchenette was further away. The windows were further apart. The proportions of the room were off, and seemingly shifting every time I blinked. It was as if everything in that darkness was untrue, malleable, subtly shifting as soon as I looked away. And so was I. Looking down at my hands, they'd seem different with every blink of my eye. They could be older, younger, scarred, masculine. It was impossible to tell. It was just diffuse enough for an anxious mind to fill in the blanks, but it felt like more than that. It wasn't just a fear of the dark. It was the dark changing me. Finally, I fumbled my way to the front door and pulled it open. And there was nothing. Just a solid black nothing. The apartment was getting darker. Even the windows were turning black. The kitchen sink was running, pushing forth dark, nondescript globs, all of which had this peculiar chemical smell. Ammonia? Marmalade was freaking out. She clung to me, digging her claws into my shirt, hissing at something in the dark. Whenever I turned around, the room would look different, swallowed further and further by the night. I could see vague silhouettes, hands reaching forward. Some small, some impossibly large. I could imagine creatures the size of skyscrapers towering forward. Impish little beasts nipping at my heels. I curled into a ball on the floor, clutching Marmalade close to my chest. Together we stared down anything and everything creeping closer. But I was losing. My light was dying. It was all going dark. Then I felt a rumble. I'd forgotten my phone was still in my pants. Bringing it out, I had a new message from Deirdre. The little screen lighting up a little bubble around me. I wasn't even on the floor anymore. I was sitting on a pile of dry grass and blue petals, and I could see the edge of a dead field stretching out around me in all directions. A wind cut through me like cold glass. And there really were things moving out there. Some big, some small, all vague and horrifying, waiting for me to look away long enough to take shape.
Hey, hun. I heard you were feeling under the weather, so I just wanted to check in. Get plenty of rest. We'll talk soon.
I played it again and again. I filled my head with her voice and my eyes with what little light the phone struggled to provide. I could feel Marmalade's pulse beating against my neck. Something would brush against me. A light kick against my foot. Footsteps rushing past. I saw nothing, but they were there. Hidden in the dark.
We'll talk soon.
Deirdre's message repeated for the 10th time.
We'll talk soon. We'll talk soon.
I don't know how long I sat there, just waiting for the dark to pass. But nothing came of it. The battery was dying. As it reached the final few percentages of power, there was little left for me to do. The light was shrinking. I couldn't hear Deirdre's message anymore. Marmalade was yowling like crazy, hissing and striking at something unseen. As the screen died, I felt the chill of the world descend on me. In the silence, and I could feel something approaching. Something careful and calculated. I couldn't see if, but I could feel it. Smiling at me. Leering. Eager. I was panicking. My skin felt like ice, and I couldn't feel my fingers. I held Marmalade close to me, and in a last-ditch effort, I flung my phone into the dark. Glass shattered. I'd thrown it through the window next to the little French balcony. A beam of morning light broke through. I turned around to an empty apartment. The layout exactly as I'd remembered it. The kitchenette still running. Torn down wallpaper lining the edges of the room. Marmalade's favorite bed still by the window, and the many Chinese takeout boxes still left unattended. Just as it should be. Except every inch of the room was covered in dry blue flower petals. Needless to say, I didn't stick around for long. I moved out to the branch office where Deirdre worked and ended up staying there. We're still best of friends to this day. I haven't been able to talk to a lot of people about what happened that night. I get the sense that whatever lived in that dark space was just waiting for someone to tear down that barrier. That hedge of flowers and patterns. Something waiting to pull me into a dark place. Never to return. Poor Marmalade hasn't been the same ever since. Her fur has turned a matted orange, and she's a lot clingier than before. She's okay, though. She's a happy cat. But it'd be a lie to say she hasn't changed. The same can be said about me. It isn't a single obvious thing, but I feel like there are things about me that aren't that same. My eyes look darker. My fingers longer. My teeth sharper and whiter. Just enough for me to notice and remember. In my new place, I sleep with the lights on. I try not to look too closely at the wall.